What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to another episode of Coding with Kevin. Today, I wanted to share a couple ways that you can step up your coding game to make you feel more like a senior developer versus a junior. So I've listed 3 things that I can think of real quick to share with you to elevate your game. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the reason why I want to make this video is because I believe you can make money fast as a developer. You just need to be able to do what you say you can do and show a little bit more advanced skill set with those things you say you can do. So I wanted to share what I think 3 examples are how a junior developer does things and some thought process with that versus how a senior developer would do things and the thought process with that. Don't get hung up in the code. This is just like dummy code. It's not meant to do anything. It's not meant to like function properly. What I want to focus on is the structure, the thought process versus the actual like, let me write this code and like see if it works. Okay. So let's get into the first part of nested if statements. All right, guys, so here's an example of nested if-else statements. And in the biz, we call it nested if-else hell. Because generally what I find when people write if, else, blah, 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 if, else, blah, 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 if, else, or else, if, they don't have a large grasp of logic or tips that they can not nest things or advanced JavaScript knowledge. So again, don't pay any example of to like what the logic here is doing, but here's an example of someone might be like, okay, if this, return this, else array.forEach, if blah, 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 return this, else if blah, 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 return this. This is very messy. And when you get into jobs at more mid-level and senior level, they're going to want you to unit test your code. And trying to write a unit test for this can be very cumbersome and chaotic. And a lot of times this type of code will have unexpected consequences, meaning that if somebody else comes in and jumps in and tries to understand what's going on and change something, they might not be able to predict if a bug down the line somewhere is going to happen, because this code is so complicated and so nested, it's really difficult. So as a senior, you typically do something called return early, where if this, return this. And then you also account for the fail scenarios. Okay, so if not this, then do this. And we're also returning something out of there. You could also write return here to make sure that this code down here doesn't get executed. So then if this is not triggered and if this is not triggered, then we have functionality to do this. This is very easy to write unit test for because we can control the parameters at a smaller level on a very single line level versus having to control parameters in depth and account for things. I hope that made sense. Again, don't get too boggled down because, you know, I said if this, return this. That wasn't my intention for you to focus on. It was the structure that, look, you don't need a bunch of nested if-else statements. So next, let's jump into looping. Now that we're using a lot of modern day frameworks like React, Angular, and Vue, I want to show you a little bit of a thought process difference between how a junior dev would handle something and how a senior dev might handle something. As we're all getting used to frameworks, like I mentioned, we want to write code that, here's an example of unordered list, how can we write code that are going to print these out without us having to write everything twice, wet code. We want to don't repeat yourself, dry code. And typically what I'll see is a lot of more beginner junior developers do something like this. They'll create an array, they'll figure out a new array, and then they'll write a for loop that will essentially equal that, which is a list item with the array in there, and then they'll push that element. A more senior dev paste this down here, these will be the lines you'll write. So if you don't have an understanding of map or for each or advanced ES 2016 and above looping statements, I would highly encourage you to make sure those are part of your top skill sets for working with React, Angular, and Vue.js frameworks. Awesome, I hope that was helpful. Finally, I want to touch on CSS and SCSS, Sas. I prefer using Sas. It makes my life a lot easier. So I want to show you a difference between if you're just starting out as a junior, you're probably using CSS. I want to show you some cool things that senior developers do using Sas that will just, again, encourage you to elevate your game. Finally, we get into CSS and SCSS. And I think I just mentioned that more junior devs will focus on just writing CSS. And honestly, a big pet peeve of mine is there are too many full stack developers who don't know advanced CSS, advanced SCSS. And I think if you're gonna call yourself a full stack developer, you need to be able to understand, how do I change the inside of a placeholder? How do I make hover effects happen? How do I use things like grid and flexbox versus just padding and margin and like brute force making something float left and right? That's my soapbox. But this code is good. There's nothing wrong with it here, but we see a couple things. We see that, okay, we have the files getting a little big, and we do see here wet code where it's write everything twice. The container link and container text have the same exact styling. So a more senior version, someone who's more advanced in front-end development, would use Sas. I love Sas. It makes my life so much easier. We have a mix-in for font style. Something very similar that you would do in JavaScript. You would have, again, a way to write something once and then just use it in multiple areas. So a mix-in takes care of our styling, and then we can actually include it in things here. Now, if you're not familiar with Sas, what I'm doing here is I'm writing the head class, which you can see here is called container. But when you have like container link, container text, when you have things with the same preface, you can actually just nest it with just an and then the following text. So now we can see here it's container link or container text. This will output to this when you run, the Sas commands, but when you're writing code, this keeps you a lot more organized. A lot of senior devs really appreciate the organization of this, the styling of this, and the use of mix-ins. So I would strongly encourage you to elevate your CSS game into learning Sas. Again, a lot of good courses on Udemy out there, a lot of good YouTube videos as well. So again, I just wanted to share a few differences for you, and they're all things you can start today and learn to improve your skill set and take with you onto your job tomorrow. I really hope it was helpful. I want to give a shout out to all 800 plus subscribers. In the last year, since January, I increased from 30 all the way up to where I am now, so I really appreciate it. If you find these videos helpful, share them with your friends, share them with whoever you can, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you want to support me, there's a couple links down below as well. But I'll be pumping out videos again this year for you guys. I love you all. Thanks for subscribing and tuning in. And until next time, take care.